Okay, so of course we're in chapter 4 of Bereshit, of Genesis, and we're in the middle of the story of Cain and Hevel. And last week we spoke about the verse that describes how they were in the field, and Cain got up and he killed his brother Hevel. And that's verse 8. And we began to discuss verse 8. And verse 8 has a few problems, but the main problem of verse 8 is that it seems like the Torah is giving us some information, but not enough information. If you look at verse 8, I'll read it here. If it's in the art scroll, it's on page 21. And verse 8, Cain spoke with his brother Abel. And it happened when they were in the field that Cain rose up against his brother Abel and killed him. But I said last week that Cain spoke with his brother Abel. In English, that makes that's a full sentence. In other words, it makes sense. You could speak. But what it really says is that Cain said to his brother Abel, Vayomer Cain el Hevel achiv. Cain said to his brother. And if that's what the verse says, then the first question is, what did he say? And the Torah does not explicitly state what he said, and therefore there are all kinds of interpretations. The Medrash offers to fill in the blank, the missing link. What did Cain say to Hevel, and how did that lead to murder? So we offered a few interpretations last week, but I saw a fascinating contemporary interpretation this week, and that is, I think it's brilliant. It doesn't matter what he spoke to his brother. You know why? The problem was that he spoke to his brother. I know usually you say you're supposed to speak to your brother, but in this case, the problem was he spoke to his brother. Who should he have spoken to? Of course, himself. Okay, so let's go back a second. Let's turn to page 7, to verse 7 and verse 6, the two verses that precede verse 8. So we know Cain was very upset. And God says to Cain, verse 6, Hashem says to Cain, why are you annoyed? Why has your countenance fallen? And here in verse 7, God gives Cain a beautiful and deep lesson. Basically, he says, it doesn't really matter what happens to the people around you. It's up to you whether you're going to elevate yourself or whether you're going to stay where you are and then sin crouches at the door. So surely if you improve yourself, you will be forgiven. We read it last week and we said that it means, im teitiv seit, if you improve yourself, you will uplift yourself. But if you do not improve yourself, sin rests at the door. Its desire is toward you and you can conquer it. So it seems like there's, again, last week we spoke a sampling of what the sages believe this verse is saying. There are multiple interpretations, but in short, you would say Cain is afraid that he lost his position of being the firstborn, right? He's the firstborn, he's the leader. Meanwhile, God turns to Hevel, to his younger brother. So he's very upset. So God says you could lift yourself back up to your former position. If what? Im teitiv, if you benefit, if you do good within yourself, if you improve yourself. And then certainly the end of the verse is its desires toward you. You can conquer it, and we discussed what that means. It's Team Shol, you can give them metaphor, you can explain to yourself, you can understand the context of your instincts. We discussed that at length. But here the point is, what the healthy approach response to God's message in verse 6 and 7 is don't worry about other people. Don't get uncomfortable that God turned to somebody else more than you. It's not about a competition with other people. It's about, are you going to refine yourself? Are you going to elevate yourself? When Cain finished hearing verse 7, what he should have done is went and sat down and had a conversation with self. What do I want from my life? Am I going to take God's message to heart? Am I going to improve myself? Am I going to allow my instincts to take over? Okay, these are all wonderful questions, but they're questions that should have been addressed to Cain internally, which is what God was telling him. God was telling him, don't compare yourself to other people. Look at yourself and say, will I improve myself, then I will be uplifted to my previous stature as the firstborn. Instead, again, he's talking to his brother. He's measuring himself in relation to his brother. In other words, he did not take God's message to heart. Okay, then it's no surprise then that his instincts overpower, and he's jealous of his brother, and he's afraid that his brother is going to overtake him, and there is going to surpass him, and therefore he kills his brother. Okay, but that's the but what's the problem? Why doesn't the Torah tell us what he spoke to his brother? It doesn't matter what he spoke to his brother. The problem was that he spoke to his brother instead of talking to himself. So in Hasidic culture, there's something called the Farbrengen. What's a Farbrengen? Literally, Farbrengen is a Yiddish word where people sit together and spend time. And it means they spend time and talk about their experiences in serving God, their challenges. Sometimes I try to meditate. It's difficult. What Hasidic discourse did you learn that inspired you? Maybe you can share some inspiration. And that's the Farbrengen. You sit together and you discuss. So it's an important part of Hasidic life. So there was once a chassid that described what's a Farbrengen. He says a Farbrengen is where one person talks to himself and everybody else listens in. In other words, a Farbrengen is not a time I come to preach. I talk to myself. Okay, you want to hear what I'm talking to myself? You're welcome to hear. And then you talk to yourself. And I happen to listen into what you're talking to yourself. That's what a Farbrengen is. So in other words, Cain should have went to a Farbrengen. God just spoke to him. He's got the message. Now he has to internalize it. Instead, he's running to his brother, talking to his brother, interacting with his brother. Who's greater? Am I greater? Are you greater? And then, of course, everything the Medrash says is true, whether they were fighting about power, who owns the field, right? We discussed this last week. Does it belong to Cain or to Hevel? All these commercial questions and other questions of competitiveness all are a result of the fact of Cain not talking to himself. So I thought that was a creative interpretation, solving this great problem where the verse says, Cain said to his brother, doesn't say what. Okay. He gets up, he gets up and he kills him. Now, what does it mean he gets up and he kills him? And if he killed him sitting down, what's the problem? I have to know exactly how he killed him. So there is an interesting Medrash. The Medrash says that Cain tries to attack Hevel. And Hevel overpowers Cain. So Cain starts pleading with his brother to let him go. And he starts appealing to his brotherhood, to his sense of compassion. And he says, what are you going to do? You're going to kill your brother? How could you kill your brother? You're going to kill your brother? How are you going to go back to our parents? It's a terrible thing. And that's what the beginning of the verse says. Cain speaks to Hevel. According to this Medrash, this is Cain speaks to his brother, Hevel, his brother. He's calling him my brother. He's evoking Hevel's compassion. And the moment Hevel lets go of Cain, then Cain gets up and kills Hevel. If Cain gets up, that's the end of verse 8. Vayakam Cain. Cain rose up. Vayakam means he got up. If he got up, it means he was lying on the floor. Why was he lying on the floor? He was taking a suntan. He was lying on the floor because there was a struggle, according to this Medrash. There was a struggle. And Cain overpowers Hevel. And then he appeals to his brotherhood, his compassion, and then Hevel lets Cain loose. And as soon as Hevel lets Cain loose, Cain gets up and kills his brother. What do you do with this Medrash? So this ties into the broader point of Cain and Hevel, and how ultimately the world, we'll get to that point in a page or two, ultimately the world has not been rebuilt. Both Cain's lineage, Hevel doesn't have any lineage. The lineage stops with Hevel. In other words, humanity, we do not come from Hevel. We also primarily do not come from Cain. We come from the third son, Shet. We'll talk about that. There's a debate who exactly, whether we have some of Cain's lineage. We'll get to that later. The bottom line is, Hevel is not the model either. The model has to be Shet, and Shet is the balance. And we'll talk about that when we get to the story of Shet. But what the Hasidic commentaries explain is that Cain, I don't mean to blame the victim here, but Hevel is also, in some sense, responsible. I don't want to say responsible. Hevel's personality is not careful enough to defend himself. Why? Because to Hevel, life on this earth is not that valuable. Why? That's his name. Hevel means vanity. Hevel means he senses that the physical life is not that important. He's connected to spirituality. And therefore, he is not as invested in defending himself in the physical way. And therefore, the Hasidic commentaries say both Cain and Hevel's attitude is wrong because they're both extreme. Cain is too invested in the physical, doesn't care for spirituality, doesn't care for morality. Hevel is the other extreme. Hevel senses that everything on this earth, all of physical life and all of physical possessions and life itself, physical life itself, has no significance, has no substance. That's the meaning of the word Hevel. It's vanity. It has no substance, and therefore he is not as invested in defending himself. And so he's almost like too humble. And the truth of the matter is, too much humility is not good. You can be very humble before God, but you have to stick up for yourself in the real world because God wants life on this earth. And if you're not going to defend the gift of life on this earth, you are, I don't want to say it's a sin because I don't want to blame the victim, but this is not the model of our attitude toward life. So according to this Medrash, both Cain and Hevel are a little bit of the problem. Of course, Cain is the aggressor. Let's not equate the two. But the point is, who's our role model? That's the question. I don't want to sit here and give out the blame and ascribe how much blame goes to who. But the question is, who's our role model? Who's our ancestor? Who do we come from? Not Cain, not Hevel. Not Cain, certainly not. Too much involvement in the physical and in trying to increase his own possessions, which then could become negative competition to the extent that I have to expand myself with the expense of the other person. And if the other person's in my way, I have to kill him. That's certainly not the model for us. But Hevel is not either the model for us. Hevel is too humble, doesn't care about life on this earth. That's also a problem. So that's a Hasidic idea. You need the balance, and the balance is Sheit, and that's what we're going to discuss as we get to Sheit on the next page. Go ahead, Warren.
Now, I have a question. At this point in the evolution of humanity, what is the moral code? In other words, we haven't reached the Noahide laws yet. I mean, why would Cain necessarily think it would be wrong to kill his brother?
That's an excellent question. That is an excellent question. There's two answers I can give. And I'm not going to tell you which one I like better. You tell me which one you like better. The traditional answer is that Adam was commanded 6 of the 7 Noahide laws. I don't want to say traditional. That's the Talmudic answer. The Talmudic answer is very legalistic. There cannot be punishment unless there is warning. And therefore, the premise is that there are 6 commandments that Adam received from God. We call it 7 Noahide laws, not 7 laws of Adam, because according to most opinions, the 7th one was given to Adam. I'm sorry, the 7th one was given to Noah. But the first 6 were given to Adam. And the sages of the Talmud, when they read the verse where God tells Adam not to eat of the fruit of the tree of knowledge, they decipher that verse and they take it apart and they show how every word of that verse is a reference to one of the 6 Noahide laws. So even though the simple meaning in the Pshat, all God is saying is don't eat the fruit of the tree of knowledge, but according to the Talmud, there's a deeper dimension, and God conveys to Adam all 6, and they connect each one of those 6 to those words. That's the Talmudic view. But I'm going to give you another view that I think is beautiful. It comes from the commentary of the Kli Yakar, who's, again, I like to quote him. He is a 16th century rabbi. He was ultimately became the rabbi of Prague, and he succeeded the Maharal of Prague. Maharal was more famous, but the Kli Yakar, I love him because he focuses on the Kabbalah, but also on the Pshat and the simple meaning of the verses. So, but to give you that interpretation, to the second interpretation to Warren's question, we want to read the next verse. It's a very, very famous verse, but nobody knows exactly what it means. Not nobody knows. It's not clear exactly what it means. And according to the Kli Yakar, the next verse is really the discussion of Warren's point. Cain's defense is, I never knew murder is wrong. Okay, so let's read the next verse. Make sure I get back to this because I don't want to forget. I'm getting old. Okay, so what does God say? What happens in the next verse? It's actually the next two verses, but the next verse as well. Hashem said to Cain, where is Abel, your brother? Hashem said to Cain, where is Abel, your brother? Ehav el achicha. And he said, I do not know. Am I my brother's keeper? Everybody knows that verse, right? Am I my brother's keeper? So that's very famous. What's less famous is God's response to Cain's claim, am I my brother's keeper? And I'm not sure what the response is. Then he said, what have you done? The voice of your brother's blood cries out to me from the ground. And then, therefore, verse 11 is the punishment. Let's leave the punishment alone. But let's go to verse 10. Then he said, what have you done? In other words, God comes to Cain and he says, where's your brother? So Cain says, am I my brother's keeper? God says, what do you mean? Your brother's voice is crying to me from the ground. Meaning to say, you can't hide. I'm God. I know everything. Okay, so you could have just said, I'm God. I know everything. What does it mean? Your brother's voice, the voice of your brother's blood cries out to me from the earth. What does that mean? So let's analyze what the Kli Yakar says, and then we're going to figure out how that answers Warren's question. So again, what does the Kli Yakar say? He says, first of all, let's ask a question. Cain says, I don't know where my brother is. Am I my brother's keeper? Conventionally, that means I don't know where my brother is. Says the Kli Yakar, that is not reasonable to say that Cain doesn't realize that God knows what happened. If God doesn't know what happened, why is Cain offering an offering to God? Remember, Cain is the first one to offer an offering to God. So obviously, Cain has some sophisticated understanding of God's providence. If God doesn't know that I killed my brother, does he know that I'm offering this potato to him, right? So if Cain is the person who doesn't think that, who thinks he can hide from God, who thinks he can kill and hide the crime from God, and what kind of God is that? What's the purpose of offering an offering to a God who has no idea that you killed your brother? And remember, there are not that many people to investigate. There's only 4 people. So it's very easy to track this down. But even so, he thinks if you can outsmart God when you killed someone, what's the point of serving this God? So therefore, the Kli Yakar says, listen what this is brilliant. When he says, am I my brother's keeper? He doesn't say, I don't know what happened. I don't know who my brother is. He says, am I my brother's keeper? Am I the person who's supposed to guard my brother's life? Am I responsible to ensure that someone else is alive? In other words, you never told me. How am I supposed to know that murder is wrong? It's my responsibility to make sure to guard people's lives. Why? Why so? Where's the document? Where's the commandment? Where is the commandment from God? Where's the moral code that tells us that you should not murder? Yeah, later Moses gave us the 10 commandments. We heard it from God. We got the 10 commandments, which says, be your brother's keeper. But me, am I my brother's keeper? The word keeper, if he's saying, I don't know, he should say, I don't know. But he says, am I my brother's keeper? That's what the meaning is. The meaning is, I had no idea. He says, I don't know. Am I my brother's keeper? I had no, what is it? Not that I don't know where he is. I had no idea that you expect me to be my brother's keeper. Lo yodaiti, I didn't know. I didn't know that I'm responsible to be my brother's keeper. So that's a good defense. So if Cain hired a lawyer, then that's what the lawyer would defend. He would say, what do you mean? You were never told. What's God's response? And this is very deep. So again, the Talmudic response is, no, God conveyed that wisdom to, God commanded Adam, telling him that you can't, murder is prohibited. He gave him 6 of the 7 Noahide laws. The problem with that interpretation, it's a wonderful interpretation. The problem is that the verses themselves don't support that. It's not pshat. It's not the simple meaning. So says the Kli Yakar, who loves pshat. He loves the simple meaning. Pshat, by the way, is a simple meaning. He says, okay, let's read the next verse. Let's see what God responds to him. God responds, what have you done? The voice of your brother's blood cries out to me from the ground. We know that the Torah is given from heaven, right? It says, God spoke to us from the heaven. But here, the voice of Cain calls out from the ground. Says the Kli Yakar, there are certain things that earth itself demands. In other words, the person himself is supposed to figure out on their own. You don't need God to say that murder is wrong. It's a natural thing that a human being could figure out on their own. In other words, we are at the point of moral development where the human being is responsible for morality that is common sense. So we know, like we know that the Torah has different forms. There's basically three categories of commandments. There are the commandments that are logical. There are commandments that are illogical, like the laws of purity and impurity. We call them decrees. And then there's in between, there's the edut, there's the testimonials. There are commandments that are historic, like keep Shabbat, to remember that God created the earth. Keep Passover, to remember the Exodus. Keep Shavuot, to remember the giving of the Torah. So that's the middle category. So one category is what's obvious, the Torah, that's called Mishpatim, the statutes. I'm sorry, the commandments, not the commandments, not the statutes, the ordinances. Mishpatim is typically translated as the ordinances. These are the laws that make sense. And the Talmud says, if the Torah would not given, we would learn from nature itself not to violate these commandments. The Talmud says we would have learned not to steal from where? From the ants, because apparently ants in the ant colonies, even though they work very hard, they don't steal from each other. I have no idea. I never studied this. Jill is not here to tell us if the science knows that ants don't steal from each other. But the Talmud says ants don't steal from each other. And you know what? We would learn that from ants. In other words, earth itself, nature itself, the natural logic dictates that you can't kill your brother, because if you can kill your brother can kill you, and there's no earth, there's no civilization. So in other words, the answer to Warren's question, the second answer from the Kli Yakar, who told Cain that they can't murder? Answer is nobody. And they're still expected to know it. It's like my kid, not my kid. The kid comes home, the parent comes home, and the kid took a red marker and covered the entire wall with red marker. So mother tells kid, why have you done this? The kid says, you never told me I can't. What does mom say? I don't have to tell you you can't. It's obvious. It's common sense. So as long as the kid is over more than 2-3 years old, it's a good defense. The mother's response is a good response. I have to tell you, you can't color the wall with the spray paint. I don't have to tell you that. It's obvious. So that's what the Kli Yakar says. That's the meaning of God's words. The voice of your brother's blood cries out to me from the earth. What is from the earth? The earth itself is the source of this moral code. You don't need God to come to you from the heaven to tell you that you can't murder. You need God to come to you from the heaven and tell you that you have to put on tefillin, that you have to fast on Yom Kippur, that you have to eat matzah on Passover. These are all wonderful commandments that you would not get from the earth. But murder you get from the earth. So I like that. Go ahead.
Animals don't kill their own species.
Some do. I don't know. Jill's not here. I don't know. Apparently some do. Some
Usually their own species they don't kill, but there are tribes that of humans who kill each other.
Yeah, and kill. I have no problem with people killing each other. People killing each other all the time. Self-defense. The problem is if murder is not wrong. If you have a society that says murder is not wrong, that is the problem. And the question is, what is the basis for that understanding? So this actually this is actually contemporary. In other words, do you need divine morality? Ultimately, do you need God to tell you that murder is wrong? So the religious people believe, in other words, the religious view is ultimately, yes, you need God to tell you. Why? Because if it's just a human commandment, if it's just human logic, you know what's going to happen? What's going to happen is that your subjective mind will justify murder. And that's why it's not enough to have the voice from the earth saying, do not murder. You're going to need God 3,000 years later to come and reiterate and say at the Sinai, do not murder. Why? Didn't God understand that the earth itself cries, do not murder? In other words, logic dictates moral logic. The human logic, natural logic would dictate that you should not murder. Yes, true, but that's not enough. That has to be protected with an additional layer of divine revelation. However, it's not enough to, Cain cannot get off the hook by saying that I didn't know. You should have known. Go ahead, Warren. I think you wanted to ask.
Yeah, you anticipated my point. I was going to say that what you're saying strikes me as really at the core of the divide between religious thought, whether it's Judaism or Christianity or some other religion, and sort of an ethical, naturalistic humanism, which says we don't need the construct of religion to know what's right or wrong, because we can develop it from a sort of a humanist perspective through a natural observation of life.
So let me elaborate. It's not go ahead. It's not 100% true that Judaism would disagree with that, because I just gave you the quote that the Talmud says, if the Torah would not be given, we would have learned theft, the prohibition of theft from the ants. We would have understood that the idea of modesty, which is do not commit adultery, the idea of modesty, we would have learned it from the cat. I don't have a cat, but apparently the cats are modest. So the point is that the Judaism is not saying, is not completely negating the humanistic perspective. It's not saying that without the 10 Commandments, we would have been living in the jungle. No, we would have been responsible to come up with morality on our own. What Judaism says, could God rely only on that? In other words, if I'm the arbitrator of morality, that could lead to dangerous places. But as a basic level of morality, the human mind is certainly a good beginning. Now, I want to say one thing, because I was going to say it later, but I'll say it now just to make this conversation full. If Cain did not have the additional layer of divine protection, divine commandments, it is possible that Cain's punishment should get leniency in sentencing. And you know what? He does. We'll get to that later. We'll get to that on the next page. Okay?
Rabbi.
Second, Barry, hang on just 1 second. So see what's happening here. We're holding Cain responsible because he should have figured it out on his own. But are we treating Cain the way the Torah would treat a murderer? We're not, and I'll prove it to you. So in some sense, Cain's defense does stand. He says, yeah, you allowed me to, in other words, God understands that I'm punishing you because I'm expecting, I would have expected you to figure out on your own, but I still cannot hold you to the same level of responsibility as I would had you had the commandment from God. And therefore, I'll say it right now, I'll spill the beans. Therefore, in the Torah, it says multiple times that the only way to atone for blood is blood. It says, the only way to atone for the blood is the blood. There are all kinds of verses that state that. And that's why the only appropriate punishment for murder is capital punishment. There is only one exception. If someone kills someone by mistake, then they go to exile. What happens to Cain? He goes to exile. He's not killed. Why not? Obviously, his defense attorney got up at sentencing and he said, we want leniency. Why do we want leniency? Because we weren't told that it's a crime. So God says, you figured it out, you should have known it on your own. So he says, okay, I should have known it, but I never had that additional layer of absolute morality that religion provides. So God says, okay, you didn't have that. We have to give you leniency in sentencing. Okay, now it's a full picture. Go ahead, Barry.
Yeah, no, this is great. I think that, I think a judge might say ignorance of the law is not a defense, number one. And number two, what about the thought of the morality without the 10 Commandments? In other words, what if one thinks that the struggle on earth is so difficult that the afterlife might be better, so murder might be okay?
Okay, so that's Hevel's problem. Hevel, we alluded to that earlier. I think you were here. Hevel says Hevel is not that into self-defense because he says, what's the worst thing that's going to happen? Worst thing that's going to happen, I'll be killed. No, it's not so bad. I think heaven is better than earth. It's not so terrible. From the perspective of Judaism, that's a problem because life on earth is where the sanctity happens. That's what God wants. So the fact that Hevel is the person not standing up, protecting himself properly, we're not going to blame the victim. We're not blaming the victim, but what we are saying is this the model for us? No. Who's our ancestor? Not Hevel, Shet.
But to know this without the commandments, it's just innate. That
murder is wrong. Again, we have the divide. Warren explained the divide. Today, some people think that you don't need religion for morality. You could be completely humanistic. Just by natural logic, you can figure out that murder is wrong. Let's say a whole code of morality, but let's stay simple. You can figure out that murder is wrong without the 10 Commandments. That is one side of the divide. The other side of the divide is you absolutely need to have religion, because if you don't have absolute morality, there is no morality. That's the other side. Where does Judaism come down on this question? I think that Judaism comes down somewhere in the middle. In other words, yes, you would be responsible not to kill even had God not told you not to kill. That is what the Talmud says. If the Torah would not be given, we would still derive the moral code from nature itself. If so, why does God have to reiterate the Ten Commandments? Because the natural code itself, the humanistic morality is not, its foundation is not strong enough, and therefore it could be altered, and therefore it could be dangerous. So we want to give an additional layer of protection. But if I'm the prosecutor in the case of Cain, I say, look, the fact that Cain did not even have the basic understanding of morality, in other words, understand that the earth itself says that murder is wrong, requires a punishment. If I'm the defense attorney in Cain's trial, I say you can't blame the guy, because he can always question, he can always say my own morality is right, is in right. You never gave him the absolute code of morality, and you need an absolute morality to have any morality. That would be the other side. What does God come down to the decision? The decision comes down in the middle. You're responsible, but you're not fully responsible. What happens later in the Torah? Later in the Torah, if you kill someone by mistake, meaning without the full awareness, you go to exile. What happens to Cain? He goes to exile. So where does God come down as on Cain's culpability? He's responsible, but he's not fully responsible. Now, again, it doesn't say so explicitly, but I think that's what can be derived from the punishment.
Interesting. Thank you.
One more point, Rabbi. I mean, if we are to assume that the Bible is a primer on elevation, and this is, we know that stories are just not arbitrary, that this is the very first story, and that between Cain, which is, he's the earth man, and Hevel, who is the kind of the spiritual heavenly man, that Cain gets most of the real estate. So that really this is the first story about good and evil, heaven and earth, and the bar is extremely low. That fratricide is okay, amorality is okay, murder is okay. He gets most of the real estate in this story, and that this is the first of many stories between good and evil, elevation, but we're starting from the bottom, and that eventually the bar is elevated, and man is held to a higher standard.
I fully agree, but even so, it's clear that there's some level of moral culpability, and that's why God does punish him, and God gives him actually a very powerful word, odorata, you're cursed from the earth. This is very strong. Even Adam was not cursed. Even Adam was not cursed. Adam, it says the earth was cursed. Here, Cain, in other words, we're not letting Cain off the hook completely, saying, well, you're the first guy on the scene, you didn't learn anything. So I agree with you that the bar of morality is going to be raised over time, because we have the benefit of learning from history and learning from Cain and Hevel. And arguably, the reason why we don't kill our brothers is because of Cain and Hevel, or because of Joseph and his brothers. So they didn't have the benefit of the history. But even so, it's not like God is totally forgiving of Cain. There is a level of culpability, and either because there was a tradition passed on to Adam, that's the Talmudic view, but the view of this pshat, like I said, the traditional view, but I'm saying that from the Talmud, not the legal view. I think that rabbis are not happy with this view because it's not enough to indict. How could God indict if there was no commandments? So I think the Talmud is a legal code. They have to say, they have to assume there was some communication from God. But pshat, like I said, the Kli Yakar is a sample, and it's very poetic. The voice of your brother's blood cries to me from the earth. This is a very interesting description. And the point is, the voice of morality, you are expected to learn something from the earth itself. And of course, we're not going to hold you to the same bar as we're going to hold the people that follow. So Bob is absolutely right about that. However, there's certainly some expectation even of Cain. If there's no expectation of him, then what's the difference between him and the chimpanzee in the jungle? In other words, not the chimpanzees kill people. They don't. They eat apples and they're very peaceful. But I'm just saying, what's the difference between the beast and the human? Right? We get to this story because we believe that Adam and Eve and Cain and Hevel are morally evolved to the point that a commandment and morality applies. If morality doesn't apply, we're back in the jungle. There's no need for the book.
But it explains why he wasn't incinerated immediately like Korach. I mean, of course, there's punishment for his evil doings, but
Agreed.
it just shows you that this is the first of many stories where man will be held to a higher standard.
Absolutely, fully agree.
Rabbi, question for you. There's a midrash that Cain and Abel have sisters. Do they figure into this story midrashically?
Yeah, what were they fighting about? Okay, the question is, what were they fighting about? So either money or real estate or woman, of course, right? So the Medrash says that each one was born with a twin, and there was an additional twin with Hevel, and they're fighting about the additional twin. And I think we said it in the past, I don't remember 100%, but I think we mentioned that the Medrash says on chapter 4, verse 1 and 2. So it says the word et. And Rashi, does Rashi quote it? Yeah, Rashi quotes the Medrash that says that the additional word et, and it's not so additional, but it's a word et that doesn't really translate into English, sort of a connecting word. Et Kayin, et Achiv, et Hevel, three extra words et times the word et implies that each et implies that there was an additional child with Kai, additional to Kai and additional to Hevel, but then with Hevel, this says it twice. Et his brother, et Kayin, et his brother, et Hevel. So it says the word twice, and Rashi says there were three. So there's three girls born, 2 men, 3 girls. That's enough for a murder. So if you're ever going to write a novel, all you need to justify the murder is 2 men and 3 women. That's enough. Okay.
And is there a midrashic response from Adam, Eve, or even the serpent to this murder?
I can't tell you there's no midrashic response, because that would mean I have to comb through all the midrashim, which I have not. I could say that I don't know, but as they say in rabbinic literature, I have not seen is not a proof. The fact that I say I have not seen the medrash is not a proof that the medrash does not exist. I think the serpent is out of the question, because we don't need any serpents, because the whole idea of the serpent was when temptation came from the outside. Right now, temptation comes from within the person himself. So I think the serpent has now been swallowed up within the person. Not that we define the person as evil, but we certainly say there is good and bad within each person. So in other words, I think the serpent is off the stage. We don't really need any serpents anymore. What the response of Cain and Adam and Eve are to the story, they don't really enter the story again until the 3rd son. And then if you want to compare Hevel's naming of her 2nd son to her 3rd son, we could look at that when we get there. That there's certainly insight there. I'm not saying I have the full picture, but there's certainly insight there. So Eve's perspective will be reintroduced when she has to name the 3rd son after the tragedy of the 1st son killing the 2nd son.
Rabbi, I had a question similar to this one, going back to Talmudic interpretation, where the commandments were given to Adam. So will Hashem hold the parents anyhow responsible for not passing it on to the next generation?
You would have to say that they have not passed it on. In other words, there's different. I would assume that according to the Talmudic view, I would assume that Cain cannot say I had not known, because they say he told it to your father and your father knew about it. Just because they know it, it doesn't mean a lot of people know the law and they don't necessarily keep it. So in that sense, I don't think the parents are responsible. No. Go ahead, Dr. Beth.
No, actually, it's a similar point to Vicky's, that when Eve eats from when they eat from the tree of knowledge, isn't that them internalizing a basic sense of good and evil? And isn't that passed on? Don't we, to your point before, like your mother doesn't have to tell you, doesn't have to tell you about each possible transgression, but that's such a basic one. Wouldn't that have been passed on through the mother?
I don't know enough to answer that question. In other words, it's basic to us, but we're living 5,000 years after the Torah has been given. In other words, we have 5,000 years of morality, of recorded history, right? What would life look like to Cain? What does life feel like to Cain? So I know that in verse number in this chapter, in chapter 4, verse number 7, what is it? Verse number 7, this is what God is trying to tell him. God is trying to tell him you have free choice. You have free choice. You can elevate your instincts, or you can let your instincts take over. That's God's message. That's the importance of verse 7. The question is, did Cain internalize verse 7? I think the answer is no. But it's certainly a struggle, to convince somebody that you're able to overcome. You can do this. You can overcome. Even today, it is a serious, better than I, that a lot of social scientists would say we really don't have much choice. We have very little choice, and we're products of our environment or our nature, and you really can hold people accountable for crimes because it's not really their choice. Okay, so free choice is under attack in the world today, in the West today. And if there's no free choice, ultimately there's no morality. So my point is, if we're debating these points today, Cain in his own mind is not necessarily fully convinced that he does have control just because God told him he does, right? So again, this is to Bob's point that humanity is trying to work this stuff out, right? So even if you say the earth informs that murder is bad, okay, but I get it, but because I'm the first one playing in this arena, how culpable am I? So that's the real question here. And I think that it's fair to say, if you compare the Torah's response to murder after the giving of the Torah and before, and to the story of Cain, you see that it's very clear, very distinct. I'm just going to go back to that verse in Numbers, which I alluded to before, but now with the help of the good people in Silicon Valley, Google, I was able to find the exact quote. Numbers chapter 35. There it talks about the story of murder either by mistake or on purpose. In both cases, it discusses the ideas of the city of refuge, etc. Here is the verses. It's fascinating. I'm just going to read. So it's on the article is 933, but you can listen to these verses. You shall not accept ransom for the life of a killer who is worthy of death. In other words, if I killed someone and I'm worthy of death, I say, you know what? I'll pay the state $1 million. Let me off the hook. We cannot do that. For he shall surely be put to death. You shall not accept ransom for one who fled to the city of refuge and returned to dwell in the land before the death of the Kohen. Same thing, if someone kills someone by mistake and the penalty is he has to run to the city of refuge, he cannot write a check to the government and get out of the crime. In other words, you can't just pay a fine, both for murder on purpose or by mistake. And now it gets very graphic here. You shall not bring guilt upon the land in which you are, for the blood will bring guilt upon the land. This is very strong. Ready? Here we go. The land will not have atonement for the blood that was spilled in it, except through the blood of the one who spilled it. There's no way to find atonement for murder unless by spilling the blood of the blood of the murderer, and that's capital punishment. Of course, practically speaking, it's not so easy to do capital punishment, and there's a lot of protections, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. We're not going to get into the law, but in principle, in practice, capital punishment is not really practiced, pun intended. But in principle, as a value, capital punishment is the only justified punishment for murder. And that's what the Torah says explicitly. You shall not you can't, there's no way to atone for blood if not the blood of the murderer. And yet Cain gets off the hook. God says, you know what, you wander a little bit. Reminds us of the city of refuge. But what about atonement? Atonement must be. So it seems that what Bob is saying and what Warren is saying is that even though we could get morality from the earth, and that's what God is saying. God is saying, what do you mean, are you your brother's keeper? What do you mean I didn't know that I'm responsible for my brother? Isn't that natural? Isn't that humanistic? Isn't that something you can reach on your own from your own wisdom? Nevertheless, God doesn't come down with the full force of the law, with the full force of the punishment. Perhaps, I don't know why God doesn't say, but perhaps for these defenses that everybody's raising here.
Rabbi, one more. These passages are structured as a dialogue between Cain and God. Is there another way to think about this in the sense of an interior or an internal dialogue in Cain and Cain's conscience is what is being expressed in this form?
Yes, certainly. I don't know that when you say God spoke to Cain, I don't know that there was a voice coming from heaven, and if you had a tape recorder, you'd be able to record the voice of heaven.
Mhm.
It's more like the voice of prophecy. Now, the voice of prophecy is all internal. It's
Right.
within myself. So it could feel like my conscience talking to myself. I'll confess, I'm not a prophet, so I never experienced prophecy. I hope you're not disappointed to hear that, but I'm not a prophet. I never experienced prophecy, so I can't tell you how it felt. But I would argue the same thing goes for verse 7.
Right.
Verse 8, when he tells himself, when there's a voice telling him, you are able to elevate yourself. And if you take control of yourself, you will raise yourself. If you don't, the sin is crouching at the door. Who's speaking to him? Of course, God is speaking to him. But through who? Through his conscience, through his inner positive, his godly soul, right? So it doesn't have to be supernatural. This could be a very natural process within Cain, taking place within Cain. Or it can name it prophecy, but this is semantics, right? Prophecy means it only means that he identifies that voice with the perspective of God, right? What would have God told me in this scenario? That's what prophecy is, I guess. I'm not a prophet, so I can't speak exactly.
Question, Rabbi?
Yes.
Is it possible that Cain wanted to strike his brother but not kill him? So consequently, the punishment was less severe.
It could be. There's a medrash, also the alternative medrash. Yeah, the medrash says that Cain did not know how to kill. So he had to, harm his body and wound his body in multiple places. And that's why the verse says in verse 11, verse 10, the verse says, what have you done? The voice of your brother's blood. But that's not an accurate translation. The precise translation would be the voice of your brother's bloods, plural. Why bloods, plural? So there are at least two interpretations that I know of. One interpretation is, Rashi brings both. Wonderful. First interpretation is, you didn't just kill Hevel. You killed Hevel and all his descendants, right? You kill somebody. It's not just one person. You're really killing a whole lineage, and certainly that you're killing a what? You're killing a half of the world's population by killing one person, or if you want to say the sisters, a quarter or a fifth. But the bottom line is you're killing a lot of people. So that is the interpretation of the word "demeachecha," the bloods of your brother. It's not just your brother; it's the subsequent generations as well. That's one interpretation of Rashi. The second interpretation is what you're alluding to: is that he made a lot of wounds. He inflicted many wounds on Cain before he can figure out where the soul departs the body. So that would mean that he didn't necessarily know what point the murder is going to happen. But again, it seems to me that he didn't stop after creating one wound and another wound. He was trying to finish this guy off. So it's plausible that you could say that based on this medrash, but I don't know if that's the most straightforward reading. Even of the medrash seems to say he didn't know how to kill him, but he was trying to kill him.
Rabbi, that's extremely interesting what his intention was. And so Midrash doesn't deal with that ad infinitum. That's a really interesting.
That's a good point. You have to prosecute a crime, you need intention, right? So that's an interesting point. I have not contemplated this point, but it seems that when I quoted this medrash, I thought it's going to be more supportive of Steve. I thought we can use this medrash to say, well, he didn't really know that the person's going to die. But it seems the medrash is saying he didn't really know how to kill. But that just means he tried harder. He never stopped. He made one wound, then another wound, then another wound. So that coming back to it, it's almost like when you kill somebody, when somebody kills someone, and there's a word for it. I think when they come back, when the gang comes back to determine to make sure the guy's really dead, right? You come back, you kill him again to make sure he's really dead. That's what it seems to me that this medrash is saying. So in some sense, the medrash takes for granted the intention, and in fact, if the intention was that Cain did not try to kill him, that's what Cain would have said. Cain doesn't say that. He either says the simple meaning, which is I have no idea, which is denial, which is cover up, which actually points to criminal intent, or he takes the moral defense. He doesn't say I didn't try to kill him. He says I didn't know killing was wrong. That's the Kli Yakar's interpretation. I had no idea that I'm my brother's keeper. I had no idea that it's my responsibility to protect another human life. I thought it's my responsibility to protect my own life. Survival of the fittest. That's what I learned in science. Survival of the fittest. That's how we advance as a species. So I'm actually doing good. I'm getting rid of the weaker person, and I'm ridding him, and I'm ridding him of the gene pool. So I should get an award, right? So in other words, that's really what Cain is saying. I had no idea that's my responsibility to take care of my weaker brother. In other words, he's making the moral defense. And the response to that is either the Talmudic response is, no, we told it to you. If you don't believe me, go look at the verses of Adam, and there it is an allusion to murder. Okay, that's if you're a lawyer, you need that. If that's the oral tradition, I'm not going to disagree here. I'm not going to sit down on a Sunday morning and disagree with the Talmud. But I would say that in pshat, in the simple meaning, it's not so simple to say that. So that's why we have the interpretation of the Kli Yakar, which I think is fascinating. Also, not just legally, but also it's also much more poetic. That the voice of your brother's blood is calling to me from the ground. This is philosophy and poetry all rolled into one. The ground itself, the earth itself would tell you that, like they say in Yiddish, you have to be a mensch.
Rabbi, question for you. So this is, I believe, the second time in the Torah that we've heard a hostile rhetorical question from God, and the response has been a lie. When
Adam may know that he could. Okay, go ahead. Go ahead.
I mean, it seems to me that Adam lied to God when he said. And anyway, the question I have is when is the time in the Torah God asks a rhetorical question and it's answered honestly?
Well, if we want to get into the details, I'm not sure Adam lied. It's a rhetorical question because God wants to give Adam, and by the way, and Cain, an opportunity to apologize, to take responsibility. So in that sense, Adam doesn't lie, but he gives the wrong answer. So let's look at the verses. And you're going to say here, Cain too. Cain lies. It depends. Cain may lie. Cain, it could be Cain is lying. But let's look at.
But I'm sorry. The Cain says lo yadati.
Yeah. So
he does know. You know.
So again, according to the Kli Yakar, lo yadati means not I don't know what happened to my brother. It's I didn't know that I'm my brother's keeper.
Yeah. Well.
I'll give it to you. Cain lied to God. Simple meaning Cain lied to God. But Adam did not. Adam. But just because he didn't lie, he didn't respond correctly, right? There's a difference between not lying and not responding correctly. So let's look at Adam.
What chapter are you in?
I'm looking to, it's going to be chapter 3. It's going to be chapter 3 and verse 8, or really verse 9. So I'm going to go back to verse 8. They heard the sound of Hashem God manifesting itself in the garden toward evening. And the man and his wife hid from Hashem God among the trees of the garden. Hashem God called out to the man and said to him, "Where are you? Ayeka, where are you?" What does he respond? He does not lie. He says the truth. He said, "I heard the sound of you in the garden, and I was afraid because I am naked, so I hid." And he said, "Who told you that you are naked? Have you eaten of the tree from which I commanded you not to eat?" The man said, "The woman whom you gave it to me with me, who you gave to be with me, she gave me of the tree and commanded, and I ate." In other words, he doesn't lie, but he misses the point. The point of the rhetorical question, when God says, "Where are you?" he should say, "I apologize, I sinned." Instead, he gives the factual answer. Where am I? I'm hiding. Why are you hiding? Because the woman gave me the fruit. So he misses the point. So I think the answer, I think that in both cases that they're rhetorical questions, and the rhetorical question is an opportunity to repent, and yet in both cases the person misses the point. Who's the first person that I can think of when approached with a rhetorical question, and they actually come up and they not only say the truth, but they also take responsibility? I'm not I would, if I have to just shoot, maybe there's an earlier case, but I think the prime example is David with Bathsheba. When the prophet comes to him and starts telling him the story of the parable of the rich person and the poor person and the sheep, he says, Chatati, I have sinned. And that's why he retains the kingship, because he takes responsibility. So the right answer to the God's rhetorical question is always taking responsibility. The wrong question is always not taking responsibility. Now, of the two, Cain is much worse, because not only does Cain not take responsibility, but either he lies straight out. That's if you read the verse simply. But even if you read the verse like the Kliyakar, he's not lying straight out, but he's actually questioning his moral failure. In other words, he's saying, not it was someone else's fault. He's saying, I didn't know this was bad, right? Adam doesn't say, I didn't know it was bad. He just said, I was influenced by somebody else, right? So Cain's failure is more dramatic and more deep than Adam's failure. But the essential failure is not, I think, certainly with Adam, not that he didn't say the truth, but he didn't take responsibility, because that was the point of the rhetorical question.
Right, Judah and Tamar also, Judah tells the truth, right?
He and he also takes responsibility. Very good. Yeah, the Talmud says Yehuda taught Teshuvah. Yehuda opened the path of Teshuvah. Correct.
But between Cain and Judah, there's nobody?
That takes responsibility. People don't like to take responsibility. It's not such a common thing. Not so common. Okay, so I think, well, because this was such a fun discussion, I think everyone did so well. We'll let you off a minute early. I think I had a lot of fun. It's always the challenge of Zoom is that there's not as much interaction as there is when we're sitting here in squeezed into our little attic here studying Torah together. But I think that over the months we're getting to the point that we're learning how to create a atmosphere of a Beit Medrash, an atmosphere of a yeshiva, even on Zoom, with a give and a take, and that increases and that makes it much more enjoyable for me and for everybody. So thank you for participating and for contributing. Thank you very much. Have a wonderful week, and we should meet each other in good health.
Thank you, Rabbi.
Thank you.
Yasher Koach, Rabbi. Thank you.
Yes, of course.